Season 1, Episode 1. Welcome to Concord Stories. I'm Jim Sherblom, Concord's audacious storyteller, and my co-host is
Belyazid, a senior at Concord Carlisle High School.
Multilingual, multicultural stories with cultural clashes and cultural assimilation are difficult stories to tell. When translating between languages with different cultural roots, such as Algonquin and English, especially from very distinct cultures, misunderstandings abound. Algonquin names have relational meaning like my does. My parents named me James Peter Sherblom after the original head of the church in Jerusalem, the original head of the church in Rome, and the anglicized form of my Swedish name, Sherblom, S-J-O-B-L-O-M with umlauts. My birth family calls me Jay. My friends and associates call me Jim, but for legal purposes, my name is James. In the first 7 generations of the Bulkley family in America, there were 14 Peter Bulkleys and 32 Sarah Buckleys. Spellings were irregular, family names were often anglicized, and historians often don't have enough information to see and recognize them as fully realized people, which we would much like to do. This is particularly difficult with indigenous tribes. Tehadawan grew up in the Musquetequid clan of the Nipmuc people. His people owed allegiance to the Massachusetts Tribal Alliance and had Nipmuc, Massachusetts, Pawtucket, Pennacook, and Pocumtuck relatives. Simon Willard's wife, Sarah, was the first white woman Tehadawan ever knew, and she befriended his daughter Tassoon, so when he needed to pick Anglo names for his wife, his daughter-in-law, and his granddaughter, he named all of them Sarah. Indigenous names were far more diverse than English names, and often unpronounceable by the English, so they chose or were given common English names, often passed down from generation to generation, including 4 generations of Thomas Wabben. If you walk out on Monument Square in Concord, there is a prominent historical marker describing Concord's foundational myth. Locals pass it without regard, but tourists pause to learn our history. It reads, "Near this spot stood the ancient oak known as Jethro's tree, beneath which Major Simon Willard and his associates bought from the Indians, a 17th century pejorative term for the indigenous people, the 6 miles of land square ordered by the General Court for the plantation of Concord, September 12, 1635. Like most foundational myths, this didn't happen as described. September 12, 1635 is indeed the date colonial legislature granted Simon Willard and his associates 6 square miles of recently abandoned indigenous land at Musquetequid, but it wasn't bought from the Indians. Jethro's Algonquin name was Tantamoose. He was a powwow, a wisdom teacher and healer. Born just west of Concord around 1614, he was 21 in 1635, not yet the indigenous leader he would grow to be. He was converted to Christianity by Reverend John Eliot in 1646, and thereafter served as an indigenous Christian minister at Oconomowoc, what's now Marlborough, for 28 years. In 1674, Reverend Eliot sent him as a missionary to the Nipmuc village of West Akeem, Sterling, which was not yet Christianized. When the West Akeem Tribal Council voted to side with Metacom and Weetamoo in King Philip's War, he took a vow of nonviolence but opted to stay and care for his people, which led Major Daniel Gookin, Massachusetts then Commissioner of Indian Affairs, to repudiate him. When in August 1675, Captain Mosley captured the remnants of this tribe, the colonists were afraid to hang or sell into slavery a nonviolent Christian minister, so Mosley had old Jethro severely whipped, 30 stripes according to the record, stole all his property, and sent him to starve to death on the Deer Island concentration camp. Fortunately, the war ended soon after the following summer, with Jethro surviving, though most of his people did not, and he lived out the remainder of his life in a Christian indigenous village of Natick. When King James II revoked the Massachusetts Charter in 1684, all land grants under the old charter reverted to the king, unless they had been legitimately purchased from prior owners. All the original leaders from both sides were now dead, unable to testify what had been agreed 50 years before, and having left no written records. Eventually, 4 old men, Richard Rice, 72, William Buttrick, 68, Jehoiakim Elias Manatucket, 68, and Jethro, old Jethro, 70, agreed to provide sworn statements. Jethro's statement said that the agreement was reached near the village center and everyone involved seemed quite satisfied. This, of course, is an ahistorical claim. The indigenous people did not initially buy or sell land, nor did they believe in individual land ownership, So whatever gifts were exchanged, this could not have been a 1635 land purchase. But foundational myths form identity and serve political useful purpose. Perhaps the best definition of an indigenous person is someone whose ancestors have lived in a place for over 100 generations, long enough to have become a part of the circle of life in that place, to be able to imagine that your people have not and perhaps could not have lived anywhere else. By that definition, many places on the earth have enjoyed indigenous tribes with deep roots and deep history, but in Western European empires, diseases and warfare created a religious and militant culture of displaced people over 100 generations or more. Medieval Christianity used the Bible to attempt to make sense of these experiences and destruction by adopting a new story, and as now New England as the new Jerusalem, passed on from England, God's chosen ones. Migrants and explorers would bring that way of relating to the world and its people and places to the settler culture we would create together in Concord.
Tahatuan was at home in the forest. He grew up on Ashadik Hill, meaning between the rivers, and was raised in the best aspects of his people's culture. His father was a sachem, or clan leader, and Tahatuan was prepared from birth to one day lead his people, for which he learned the ancient traditions and stories of his people. He learned to hunt, knew all the best fishing locations around the Musquetaquid rivers and ponds, how to burn the underbrush for better farming, and all the trails through the forest. His walking gait was rapid and narrow, 1 foot in front of the other, and when necessary, he could quietly vanish into the surrounding woods. Tahatuan was a person of this place. Woods and water, hunting and fishing, this was his natural habit. He spent many winter evenings listening to his grandparents and parents explain how God created Turtle Island for the Nipmuc people, and the duty of every clan and tribe to preserve its place in the cycle of life. His life was deeply spiritual, centered on sacred obligations to his creator God, or Great Spirit, his family, clan, tribe, and the web of life. Then as a teenager, he began to hear stories of strange landless white men with big ships and their remarkable weapons. Tahatuan had stone tools for woodworking, and a particularly fine stone axe imported from hundreds of miles further west, which he cherished. He carved bowls for eating or storage and was adept at creating dugout canoes that could glide seamlessly through the water. His technique required finding a suitable pine or oak tree on Ashadik Hill, cutting it down and removing its top branches, and carving out up to a 10-foot section in the middle with his woodworking tools, which he would complete with a controlled burn, creating a long open canoe for transportation of the people and goods. Tahatuan learned how to build geodesic, witu, circular one-room house, to live in, and how to build a bigger ceremonial house on the top of the sacred Ashadik Hill for council meetings and ceremonial dances led by the clan's wisdom teacher. As he came of age, the wisdom teacher would initiate Tahatuan through arranging his personal vision quest, and thereafter Tahatuan was eligible to join the men in hunting and in sweat lodge ceremonies. Sansqua, whose name she carefully kept from the English colonists, perhaps for magical reasons, is the title for a female sachem, and Sansqua of the Mystique clan of the Massachusetts tribe would have come from a leading family of one of the neighboring tribes. Because she moved to the protection of Tahatuan when her husband died, it is thought she may have been his elder sister. She grew up learning to tend the fields, growing corn, beans, and soft rind squashes, the 3 sister crops. She learned to correctly identify and gather edible blossoms, seeds, tubers, and roots from the forest to flavor her stews, and augmented the nutritional value of her garden. She gathered wild rice, onions, and water parsnip to create healthy communal meals, even trapping wild ducks and geese in season. She gathered wild strawberries, blueberries, blackberries, currants, and grapes to add sweet flavors to her cooking. Sansqua knew how to make tea or medicinal infusions from sarsaparilla, elderberries, black cherries, choke cherries, rose hip, and cranberries. Her mother taught her the art of medicinal herbs, and she would pass this skill on to her stepdaughter-in-law, Tossin. In tribal councils, she was a respected leader, and well-spoken as any man would be. And on her husband's death, she became supreme sachem, which means the supreme chief. She had learned to work raw hides from animals, first removing excess fat and tissue with the sharp-edged stone knife, and then to scrape, wash, and clean the hide, removing unwanted hair and softening the leather through pounding it upon rocks, to make the supple and functional clothes. Sanskwa was an artist, a craftsperson, maker of medicinal infusions, and a leading diplomat among her people. She weaved elaborate baskets, bags, and mats. For this purpose, she gathered large quantities of bulrushes, cattails, sweetgrasses, and tree bark fibers. Her mother taught her how to weave them close together, balancing just the right mixture of flexibility and rigidity, strength, and colorfulness. Then she would dye the basket to make animal or geometric designs. Her baskets were beautiful, functional, and much prized in indigenous exchanges of goods. Miskedquid was their world, and their cultural context. Indigenous people seemed to pick up more information traversing a landscape than an outsider, someone from a culture that no longer highly values physical intimacy with the place, that regards this sort of sensitivity as a primitive attribute, something a visitor from an outside culture would be comfortable believing they had actually outgrown. And somewhere in this process, a person begins to sense that they, themselves, are becoming a part of this place, so that when they are absent, they know this place misses them. The illiterate indigenous nipmunks were interwoven into Miskedquid in a way that the literate English settlers, literally, given the cultural context, could never become. To better understand the world of Tehachwan and Sanskwa, it helps to begin with a little deep history, which may explain some cultural divergences over millennia that shaped and informed the cultural interchanges that our narrative will then focus on. Geographic features, such as rivers, make natural boundary markers. The Abenaki people of northern New England lived north of the Merrimack River. The towns of the Wampanoag people of Cape Cod were east of the Saguenay River. Before the English colonists came, the Miskedquid River appears to have been a boundary between the Massachusetts people to the east, the Pennacook or Pawtucket to their immediate north, and the Nipmuc people to the west, whereas the larger Massachusetts tribal people lived mainly within 20 miles of the coast. The less densely populated Nipmuc homeland extended as far west as the Connecticut River Valley, with an abundance of freshwater rivers and streams running through it. And family relationships interconnected the various tribes. This is the initial context of our 400 years of stories.
This is Reverend Dr. Jim Sherblom.
And Ayanor Belyazid, reminding us that honestly telling our authentic stories helps us to better understand the world and our place in it. As we prepare for our Concord 250 celebration, it's time for us to tell our stories in a new way.